Welcome to Digication Scholars Conversations. I'm your host, Kelly Driscoll. In this episode, you'll hear part 2 of my conversation with Sarah Zurhellen, Assistant Director of the Writing Across the Curriculum program at Appalachian State University. More links and information about today's conversation can be found on Digication's Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Full episodes of Digication Scholars Conversations can be found on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. I loved hearing about how you kind of took over this website and for the school and had to just boots on the ground learn how to program in PHP, and it sounds like fix some bugs might have been your calling for a little while as that was getting revised. But it does sound like that experience made you, and I think you might have been naturally kind of inclined to explore and take that on where others might not have been that brave. But because you did that and had the attitude of, we're just going to get in there and move things around and figure out what works, has also been an asset to you in what you're doing now. And this kind of attitude of, well, you can take this, but you have the opportunity to make it your own, and that it may take some exploration and creativity and experimentation to do that, but that's all part of the learning as well. So, what year was it that you had taken over the website? This was at University of Missouri, is that right?
Yeah, I think it was 2008. Because I started my PhD in 2007. So I think it was 2008. Because I had gotten to know my office mate. And I say office mate, all the grad students were in one big room. We were like desk mates. Like we were like sharing the same desk. So we had to like take turns using the same space. But yeah, I think it was 2008. So it wasn't like lots of people were doing cool digital things at that point. I just wasn't. Like it had not been part of my life prior to that moment, and wasn't really something that I thought of myself as like being good at, right? I never thought like, oh, I'm a tech person. Like I have no sort of like mechanical engineering skills. If I take something apart, it will never get put back together properly again. And that's how I kind of always thought about tech stuff, right? That like I always thought of like the hardware aspect. I never thought of, the software aspect of it and like what that looks like. And then I just sort of learned, right, that like actually I'm good at breaking things and not worrying about it. So the stakes are just not that high, right? And they are for certain people. I mean, certainly you should never put me in charge of something that can't break, because those stakes would be way too high. But I guess that's kind of my approach to learning. It's like the stakes shouldn't be that high. It's like you're learning. So part of that process has to be failure. And I guess maybe back to your earlier question about how I use portfolios, that's always a really important part of the narrative that I ask students, for both undergraduate students and graduate students, is to think about where are the places that you're not doing as well as you had hoped or as you might have thought you would. And I do a lot of reflection in connection to life. And so a lot of assignment reflections are about, what are you doing well? What are you not doing well? But also like, what is happening in your life right now that might be distracting you or preventing you from sort of maybe putting in the time that you need. Like maybe in order to do this thing well, you need more time and you don't have it right now because you have other demanding classes and your work is really busy right now. Or a lot of students, go through all kinds of personal loss when they're in college. And so kind of working through like, it could be anything from I just broke up with my my person to, my grandparent has died. And, this was a person who I had all these very like early childhood relationships with, and I've had to leave them when I went away to college. And so now I'm like experiencing all these emotions about that. And so I think giving students and portfolios give students a space to do this, right? To make these kinds of connections between how is what is going on in my personal life connected to what is going on in my student life, and how can I kind of bridge that gap to see myself as like a whole person who is all of these things happening together, not just this or just that.
Yeah. And I think that for the students too, to have that kind of connection and space to reflect on, it's the whole human experience that's part of the learning experience that they're having during the time at the institution.
Yeah.
And very often, students may not have had the opportunity to make those connections and realize how those are important for people around them to understand and know, but also for them to understand and know about themselves. And it's something that's going to continue to inform them if this is a practice that they continue even when they get out into the workplace, to have some pause and recognize, okay, this project didn't go as well as I had hoped it would. There are these things going on in my life right now. It doesn't mean that the next project that I'm going to do might have the same outcome, and get better at kind of communicating and recognizing when things are working well and when they're not. And that it's all part of the human experience. So I think it's wonderful that even at the institution that they're given that kind of space and time to use reflection for that purpose.
Yeah, I think it's really useful. I used to teach the introduction to writing across the curriculum class a lot, in our rhetoric and writing studies program, and it was always my favorite class to teach, because it was thought of as a sophomore level class. Most students coming into it are in their second year, and they tend to come into the class with this attitude of like, why do I have to take this? I've been writing things since I
Right.
started kindergarten, right? And I know how to write. And this is another like general education requirement when I just really want to get into my major classes. And I actually was thinking about this earlier when you asked about the aha moments for faculty, because what I loved about teaching this class
Yeah.
was the aha moment for students, because I loved the class because they would come in with this kind of just second year attitude of like, I've got this. I know how to college now. Like, I'm comfortable in this space. I have confidence that maybe I didn't have as a first year student. And this class is really unnecessary for me. And not everybody felt that way, but a lot of them. And then as they moved through the semester, and they spent a lot of time on those reflections. And sometimes it was, right? Like coming to learn as a person that we all have to prioritize things, and we make those choices. And so maybe it's true that actually, you did not spend enough time doing research for this project because you prioritized your chemistry exam because you're a chemistry major. And you know what, maybe that's okay. Like, maybe that's that is a trade-off that you've made in your prioritization. But what if you had thought about the research project differently and actually designed it so that it would help you study for your chemistry exam? Like, that's another approach. And so much of that class was like teaching problem solving and like learning strategies in this way. And I would get emails from students like the next semester or the next year that would say, thank you so much. I know I was kind of an ass during that class. But now I'm in like my psych methods course, or I'm whatever the next kind of step was. And they're like, I am thinking so much. I'm using so many of the things that we did in that class. And so rarely did the aha moment happen during that semester. Occasionally it did, and that was always fun. But it was like the future aha moments that would come via email or like note in my mailbox that I was always like, that's the best feeling of like I knew it was going to help you, and I just had to kind of wait it out, right?
Yeah.
So
Oh,
yeah.
well, and it was a real pinnacle moment for them if they took time, even after the class is done, to reach back out to you to say thank you, right?
Yeah, and it was always funny how they would position themselves. And oftentimes it wasn't students who I thought of as being particularly difficult, but in their heads, that's what they had been, right? Like they had been really resistant to the course. And I mean, occasionally,
That's what they felt.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So it was, yeah, those were great. Those were
Yeah.
great
Are
aha
there
moments.
specific, you talked a little bit about your kind of approach to the reflections, but are there specific prompts that you give them to kind of help them get started with this type of reflection? Because I can imagine for many of them, it could be the first time that they've really been asked anything of that nature within the context of a course. And I know in our work with the institutions that very often reflection in general is just something that students haven't really been asked to do.
Yeah, reflection is hard, and it's a skill, right? It's not something that most people do well automatically. Um, and I think as I've aged, I think I've come to like recognize when I meet adults who are good at reflection, um, they have a different perspective on their lives. So I try to talk to students about that sometimes because I think I was slow to come around to the idea that reflection was valuable. I talked earlier about the introduction to teaching composition course that I took as a master's student. And I was the resistant student in that class the whole semester. I mean, I did it right because I was an overachiever. I wanted to like make the teacher happy and do the right thing, but I was grumpy. Every day after class, I would say, I don't understand why we have to do these things. Why are we writing multiple drafts? Why are we reflecting on our feelings and ideas? And so like I was that person. And then and I don't even know what my aha moment was, right? Except that it was like the next semester and I was really struggling. And I had that moment of like, oh, if I stop thinking about this as something that has to be perfect the first time, and if I start setting aside 5 or 10 minutes to just write down my thoughts about what I'm doing in relation to this thing, that
Mhm.
is actually helpful. So yeah, shout out to Georgia Rhodes for that one because she taught that class. And I mean, I'm sure I was one of those students who was rolling my eyes when she was explaining things to us. But it was sort of life changing. And so I think about that when I'm teaching reflection. And I think about that when I'm talking to faculty about teaching reflection, because I think for a lot of disciplinary faculty, especially, it can feel like an extra, an add on, a thing that is unrelated or too disconnected from the content of their course that they feel a lot of pressure to shove into one class, right? And that they're under, I think, a lot of pressure. Like students need to know all of this material by the time they leave my class. They don't have time for reflection. Or in other conversations I've had with people, for instance, we have a great first year seminar program here, but it's largely taught by adjunct instructors. And so when you start talking to people about doing reflection in first year seminar, they say, oh, that would just be one more thing that the teacher has to grade. And like, we don't want to add to the workload of faculty who we know are already being taken advantage of by the institution. And so a huge part of that for when I'm in the classroom is helping students see reflection as central, right? Like to their learning, not as an add-on, not as busy work, but as really central. And so I do that by scaffolding it. So at the beginning so I do multiple kinds of reflection. I ask students, we do weekly reflections, and there's a list of, I think, 14 or 15 questions. And I tell them, you don't have to um, reflect on any of these, but if you need a guide, choose a few and just think about them and answer them. Um, and typically what I see is students start very rigidly at the beginning of the semester. And then as they become more comfortable with the process, because it is becoming more comfortable, like talking to yourself, right? And so that takes time. And then they start to be freer in sort of how they approach that. I also, and this is a sort of weird policy, I know, but for those weekly reflections, I tell them they get credit for doing them, but I tell them that I don't necessarily have to read it. So they're allowed to turn it in and say, I don't want you to read this. So if they need that space to like complain about something that's happened in class or complain about me, or, they like it is their space. And so they can turn it in, and we work on the honor system that they say, this thing that I've uploaded into our learning management system is my reflection. I promise. And I say, okay, I'm going to give you credit. I'm not going to read it. I promise.
It's really just for me. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that has been really good for some students who need it as that space. It's also really effective because I, in my position, either my previous position when I was non-tenure track faculty in the rhetoric and writing studies program, I was working with mostly first and second year students. Now I teach the like teaching in the writing center class for graduate students who are working in the writing center, and most of them, not every single one, but most of them are first semester graduate students when they're taking the class. So again, they're going through that like really, really stressful beginning of a new experience. And so I think having a place to kind of just unwind and unload. And I mean, I've heard from so many students, like that is the number one assignment. I learned through the surveys I ask at the end, and also through students who just tell me, I thought that was going to be the dumbest assignment and it was the most valuable. And that just happens over the course of them doing it. But when I ask them to reflect on assignments, I'm super directive at the beginning of the semester, and then less so as the semester goes on. And I tell them that. I say, I'm going to give you really specific questions. They're directly related to the assignment or to something I've asked them to do in relation to it. And then and I say, like, by the end of the semester, I'm expecting you to come up with your own questions to answer,
Right.
because that's part of the learning process, right? Is like, I, I want to help you get better at reflection, but ultimately the reflection is for you. So it should belong to you. And I try to talk to faculty in the same way that reflection is great for, I mean, I can give people articles all day long to read, right? I can show them all the scholarship in the world. And there's plenty of it that talks about the value of reflection in learning and in a transfer of knowledge and in all of these areas. That doesn't necessarily fix the really practical issues that faculty have in terms of the
Right.
amount of content they're trying to teach, or the fact that they're not paid enough for their labor. And so thinking, and this goes back to the portfolio conversation, like, how can you integrate this? Where can you make space? Where are there things that you're doing now that are taking up too much of your time and aren't actually valuable
Mhm.
to you or to students, that might be replaced by reflection that could potentially simplify your work? Because I personally find reflection much easier to evaluate than, like the 10
Right.
page essay. And also, like, where can you add it in ways that will be valuable to students and not necessarily take more of their time, but make the time that they're spending
Yeah.
more
And this
beneficial in the long
conversation
term.
about labor is important. And I was really excited to have the opportunity to join one of your sessions at this summer's ABLE summer meeting and learn more about the ABLE task force. And I think there was actually a published piece. I pulled it up because I wanted to mention it while we were talking today. Let me see if I still have. You were part of a article that was published in the International Journal of ePortfolio around digital ethics and ePortfolios, developing principles, strategies, and scenarios. And that was back in 2021 and was part of this kind of larger conversation around the field of ePortfolios and the connection with ethics. And I know one of the kind of sub areas within that is this kind of ethics around the labor connection to ePortfolios for those that may be implementing the various ePortfolio projects on campus, but all the way down to the labor of the faculty and the students that are utilizing them, whether they're utilizing them for teaching or whether they're utilizing them as part of the assignments or projects that they give students and the time that students invest in them. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about that. And I know that you're going to be participating in another Digication Scholars conversation that's just focused on that. But I would love for you to share a little bit about that today as well.
Yeah, sure. And I'll try to keep it on the explanatory level, and we can go deeper in the other conversation with other members of the task force. But that is, we started, I think, in 2019, but we're really interested in developing some principles around digital ethics and ePortfolios, bringing a lot of different interests to the table. Obviously, like a lot of people are interested in privacy and how we're protecting students. I was coming at it sort of from a digital literacy perspective, in the sense that I think one thing that we don't do a great job of, at least here, and maybe there, I know different schools have different kind of approaches to this, and some have focused a lot more, but just a sort of like basic or baseline digital literacy, and making sure that students have that when they leave. And people talk a lot about students are digital natives, and they're just born in this space and they use it all the time. Well, I would regularly assign a PDF and walk into the classroom, and all the students would have their laptops turned sideways because they didn't know how to rotate the PDF, right? And that's a sort of basic skill that I think just, a real quick story that shows that they don't know how to do everything. But the biggest thing is to
Yeah.
just ask, right? If something feels unnatural, or it feels like it should be easier to do in a digital space, like Google it, right? Look it up is the kind of like quick. So I was sort of interested in the principles from that perspective, and that led into like kind of exploring that idea, right? Of um, why students get sort of depicted as so familiar with everything digital, but don't necessarily like develop that skill set over time. And that was sort of where labor came into um, the question, right? Because the same is sort of true of faculty. Faculty are using technology all the time to do all kinds of things. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're just comfortable just adding
Right.
new software, right, to their sort of teaching toolkit. And so I got really interested in the work that required and what it was doing to people, because I was teaching students how to use a new platform, but I was also teaching faculty how to use a new platform. And as that was happening, I was experiencing a lot of resistance to the idea that you could approach it playfully. Not so much from my students, but from other students and from other faculty. And I sort of learned, again, like like on the job, right? On the job training, that students are they're sort of taking on the attitude that faculty are bringing into the classroom when they're introducing the new technology. So if faculty are introducing it as just this new really hard thing, but we all have to do because it's a requirement for whatever reason, then students are doing the same thing, and they're adopting that same approach to it, and that's kind of the end of the conversation. And so, like, that attitudinal shift that I saw just made me really curious, and drove me in this direction of like learning about emotional labor, right? Which is
Mhm.
kind of, I feel like, far afield from where I started when I joined the digital ethics task force. But that was the kind of turn that my interest took. And maybe again, I'm like the reflection broken record. um, but I was really interested in this idea that using technology and learning technology requires work from people. And that some of that work is really obvious, like when we're sitting in the room and I'm showing you how to literally do something, right? It's very procedural. But then some of it is much more invisible and abstract. It's happening in the background, it's happening in ways that we don't easily identify. And because of that, nobody's
Mm.
sort of getting credit for it, right? Like students aren't getting graded or assessed or evaluated on that part of their work, and neither are faculty. And so that's sort of where my interests have turned now. And I don't have any real answers at this point, except that I think it's something that we'll need to be more attuned to in the future, because people talk a lot about information overload, and how there's just too much information coming at us all the time and we can't process all of it. And they talk about cognitive load, is another, way of sort of thinking through how much can your brain process at a time. But oftentimes when we're talking about cognitive load, we're also still talking about information, like the substance or the content of something, rather than the actions of interacting with it and sort of I don't know, like acculturating our lives to it, right? And so that's the part that I'm interested in and not at all an expert in. So I can't say anything smart about it except to say that I think it's going to
Yes.
matter more and more. And I wonder how much of some of the sort of I don't know, we've been
Yeah.
calling it like the COVID exhaustion on our campus, but like this idea that we have this return to normal. We are fully back on campus. But now we're, in addition to doing all the things we did before the pandemic, we're also doing all the things we did during, when everybody was at home. And so now we have all these new technologies and all these new practices. And in some ways, that's made us a much more inclusive space, which is great. And it's made a lot of the things we offer more accessible to a lot more people. I do a ton of Zoom appointments for graduate students who could never come to the Writing
Yeah.
Center face to face because they don't live here. So that's fantastic. It's a great thing that we can offer that service. It also just adds a whole other layer um, to the work that people are doing. And I really saw that with working with graduate students who had been trained during the pandemic to work in the Writing Center, and all of a sudden they realized they were going to come back face to face, and they were like, oh my God, I suddenly feel like I don't know how to do my job. Like everything I learned how to do online, and now I'm going to have to like talk to people face to
Very
face. It's a
intense.
totally different modality of interacting, and I don't feel trained to do that. And so that was a lot more work for them suddenly.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for speaking to that. And I'm very excited as the results of the survey that the Able Task Force has shared out, as those results start to go in. And I think that these are very important conversations. And you're right, so many changes were implemented so quickly. I mean, across society, but we saw it most deeply within higher ed in our particular roles, that an enormous amount of learning had to happen very quickly in order to help continue keeping that going. And yeah, the shift to, what I think will never really be normal, but trying to now grapple with the new way of working and teaching that we adapted to, and now trying to figure out, what that bridge is to what we're doing now, which for some people is still a combination of virtual and in person, but some are fully back in the classroom. So there's just so much to consider. And I think, as a collective, taking time to reflect on that, and making note of, what elements were really successful for us, what elements did we feel like we faltered in, but would like to continue down that path. Where are we making the best use of our time? That emotional labor costs that you mentioned, the whole human experience that we spoke about earlier, they're all intersected in what we're managing at work and outside of work, and how those interrelate. So I'm really excited to see the results of that study when it is done, and I'll be sure to include the link to the survey in the show notes when we publish this episode, so that those that might be interested in contributing to it can easily get to it. And we'll be sure to do that in the other podcasts that you'll be participating in with other members of the task force as well.
Thank you so much. That'd be awesome. Yeah, I'm really excited to see what we find.
Well, Sarah, we have reached the end of our time together today. I want to thank you so much for joining me. It was a pleasure to talk to you and to learn more about you. And I'm excited to share this with our community. I think there's so much that you're doing within your institution for faculty and students that others will be very excited to learn about. And we'll have to continue to stay in touch.
Thanks, Kelly.
Appreciate it. Bye. This concludes our conversation. To hear our next episode, be sure to subscribe to Digication Scholars Conversations on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. The Digication Scholars Conversation series is brought to you by Digication, a technology platform powering the most innovative ePortfolio programs in K-12 and higher education. Our website can be found at digication.com. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please like, subscribe, and share with a friend. Thanks for tuning in.